Welcome to Kind Words for Tired Teachers, the podcast that meets you where you are, acknowledges the great work you do, as well as the issues you face, and reminds you that you're not alone. I'm Vivian Smith. I'm a certified coach, a qualified teacher, a speaker, and author of Amazon bestseller Kind Words for Tired Teachers, Rediscover Your Passion and Purpose. If you found yourself wondering where it all started, or perhaps when it all changed, you're not alone. Today, we're going to step back and zoom in, if you like, to ask, how did we get here? So today, I'm going to be covering the themes of the rising toxicity in the classroom, certainly based on the NASUWT report and the speech given by Patrick Roach at their conference. I'll be a little late to the party, I admit, talking about Adolescence, the drama Adolescence, and what that kind of throws up for us to look at, certainly with online indoctrination and the changing relationships between students with each other and also between boys and girls as well. We'll also be referencing The Anxious Generation, the book The Anxious Generation, and looking at the links between anxiety and smartphones. And perhaps looking at what is working when it comes to banning smartphones in the classroom. You know, is it a whole school ban? Is it just restriction of usage? We'll be looking at some ideas about what works and perhaps what doesn't. So it's not just stress or workload that weighs on teachers, and I know we've talked about that as well, but it's the shift in what we're dealing with day to day. So let's start there. I'm going to read some quotes from Patrick Roach's speech to the NASUWT conference this month. We are seeing a rise in misogyny, racism, and homophobia in our schools. Pupils are parroting online influencers. We're seeing attitudes that devalue women, that celebrate aggression and silence empathy. I was reading the Guardian article following that report, and it made for some hair-raising reading, to be honest. There was one female teacher whose pupils would only communicate with her via her male TA and the boys in her class, and they were only aged 10. So that's quite shocking, isn't it, when you think about that, you know, to display that the arrogance and the confidence, if you like, to take that stance. But also a pretty awful indictment, really, of what can go on in classrooms these days. There was also the teacher that the union had represented who was knocked unconscious when a pupil threw a laptop at her head. Again, I think you could say these are isolated incidences, but actually, I think that report showed that there was, you know, the troubling behaviour, and also things like derogatory language were on the rise. So this survey that the NASUWT did, one of the troubling aspects of that report was that 69% of UK teachers reported a rise in derogatory language among pupils. And, you know, that's an indication of what could be happening in schools. So it's not just about behavior, is it? It's about values as well. It's about, to some extent, pupils who don't have that ability to think critically, don't have the maturity to evaluate what they're hearing and perhaps recognize that all is not what it seems. I'm not by any means blaming teenage boys for this. I think you know, we need to recognize that they are children, and that as adults, particularly in the education system, and as parents as well, we're here to protect them and try to shield them from some of this really insidious and sinister indoctrination and grooming that goes on online. But it also reflects, I suppose, that that there's been this shift in language and attitudes amongst students, and that the teachers more than ever before, perhaps, are carrying this enormous and exhausting emotional load. So, this doesn't just appear out of thin air. It's, we're talking about changes online. They're in spaces that we don't always see, that we can't always control, either as teachers or as parents, in fact. And I suppose I'm a bit late to the party in commenting on the recent drama Adolescence. But this is a truly terrifying portrayal of boys being drawn into the manosphere, I gather it's called, and online misogyny. And the idea that boys are seeking belonging online, but what they're finding instead is very toxic narratives that they're influenced by. That girls are having to navigate that sort of fear and also the anger, and that teachers are caught between the feeling of compassion for these young people, but also they are kind of in the eye of the storm. They're at the midst of the crisis and having to try and do their jobs, but also influence positively and try to redress the balance. That drama, again, really highlighted, didn't it, the gap between digital literacy and emotional resilience. And I think I was certainly reading some of the comments online where one businesswoman, I think, had said how shocked she was by the portrayal of the school that this boy is a pupil at. And what the police discover, that sort of culture that they discover when they go in. And her husband, who is a current teacher, had said, "You don't know the half of it," And certainly for me, I found it brought up some disturbing memories for me of schools I've been in, schools I've experienced myself as a teacher, and that sense of kind of barely controlled chaos, anarchy, I don't know what, with teachers literally just on the edge, trying to do their best, trying to send things in a more positive direction. So for me, certainly it made very disturbing viewing, as I'm sure it did for all of you. I think one thing that's good, even if it perhaps didn't go into enough detail about what all the different emojis and codes meant, I think what it did is it started us talking, didn't it? Started us talking about what's really going on. I know for lots of people who work with young people, it kind of raised awareness of this other layer, this new, if you like, this new world that didn't exist when we were younger, when we were navigating adolescence ourselves. And it is tempting, isn't it, to think that this is all about behavior. And I have a quote here: when you step back, you start to see it's about something even deeper. It's a rewiring of childhood itself. So in my book, as you may know, I interviewed a wide range of teachers from all sorts of subjects. Some of them were very experienced, some of them had only just joined teaching, some equally had left teaching. And this quote is from a very experienced teacher talking about the anxiety that exists amongst teenagers these days and how much worse it is. So she says, "We've talked as a department and with other professionals repeatedly about what was it, when was it that it changed, and why and how. And nobody can actually pinpoint that change of mindset in our students. There are so many things to factor into it. There's a psychologist called Jonathan Haidt who has just written a book called The Anxious Generation: How the Great Rewiring of Childhood is Causing an Epidemic of Mental Illness. They've stemmed the anxiety of teenage children to the date when smartphones came in." And I have a quote here from the book, which was published in March 2024. Jonathan says, "Around 2012, the nature of childhood fundamentally changed. Adolescents stopped spending as much time with each other face to face. Rates of depression, anxiety, and self-harm began climbing, first among girls and then among boys." What I found interesting also about that book is he observed and reported on the difference in parental attitudes. He commented on the fact that students were less resilient as a result of their parents being far more risk averse far less willing to let them take risks in the real world. And as you know, of course, this is how we learn. We learn from taking risks, making mistakes, and we learn from that. But that this generation of parents, he felt, were taking less risks. They were far more protective, if you like, of their children. However, the place that they really needed to protect their children was in the online sphere. And of course, many of them are and were at that point and still are now unaware of the incredible breadth of what's happening online and what they're exposed to, what kids are exposed to these days. So the key tipping point may have been 2012, where there was a shift from face-to-face connection and to a sort of a curated online presence. And there are some really worrying statistics that date back from or start from around that period. For instance, NHS Digital reports that harm among girls aged between 13 and 16 rose by 68% in the period between 2011 and 2018. I'm sure you're well aware within your own school, amongst your own students, about girls who self-harm. And certainly I can think of one particular student that I've worked with. And I know, because I could see, and I realize this is anecdotal evidence, but I could see for her that her extreme addiction to her phone was causing a lot of unnecessary and additional stress, which was then feeding into a return, sadly, to habits of self-harming. In fact, recently she has been back in hospital for taking it too far. Parents have become increasingly anxious about an escalation in the practice. And she is a student who is completely and utterly unable to operate without her phone. Now, at the Alternative Provision Centre, we teach one-to-one. And so, we don't have the same kind of restrictions on phone usage that I might have done in a bigger class. So when I was teaching, 30 to 32 students, it's a little bit more delicate, the balance between helping the students feel safe and secure and accepted and meeting them where they're at. And also then protecting them perhaps from the distractions of being online. So we've been working on that one, she and I, but it's very hard for her. She can't turn the phone off, really. She can turn it over, but she still regularly turns it over and makes a comment about someone's unfriended her or done this or done that or whatever. And when I've tried to really push her to put down the phone or turn off the phone, she merely just resorts to taking very, very long loo breaks. And I know that you'll be familiar with that too. When students take breaks during lessons, it's no massive surprise to hear that a lot of them are online or using that time to go online. So I'm not sure what your experience is in your school, but I'm wondering how you feel about smartphone bans. Do they work? Is there a way to make them happen effectively? How do we put the brakes on? How do we create spaces where young people can reconnect with each other and with themselves? Certainly at the last school I worked at, children were not allowed to use smartphones within lessons unless the teacher had said it was, for research or to do a quiz or whatever. But there was a constant battle, particularly with particular students who just pushed those boundaries all the time. And the amount of phones I remember having to confiscate, and then doing the policing, not willingly, I have to say, but during break duty, particularly break duty in the hall, it was always a nightmare because there were just groups of students, particularly year 11s, who get to be much bigger and scarier and harder to confront, I think, particularly as a new teacher. where they would just be on their phones the whole time. They'd be videoing each other. There'd be all those things where, where we know that there are risks. It's like an infringement of someone's personal rights. That was a really big issue. And some of the time I certainly noticed colleagues just choosing to ignore it because it was hardly worth the hassle of having the confrontation or writing up the detention or whatever it was. But what can we do? I certainly have a friend who regularly gets students to hand in phones at the beginning of her lesson. But unless your school supports that as an overall, a school-wide policy, that's quite hard to do as well. We have to have a consistent approach, don't we? So in my research, I found that 99.8% of UK primary schools and 90% of secondary schools restrict phone usage. This comes from the Children's Commissioner, a report in 2024. Also from a UNESCO report of the same year, 79 education systems worldwide recommend bans. So other countries are instituting bans of smartphones in schools. I think you may know, if you've heard me talk before, I work as an oracy leader as well for the oracy charity, the English Speaking Union. And I was asked to write an article for their publication. And it was a sort of mock debate. And I was taking the side of banning smartphones in schools. So one of the fun things I found was this mention of this condition, which apparently is fairly common, called text neck, where people's posture and muscles are being affected by the constant position assumed when texting. There have been other rumours that muscle development and a change in the physiology of the hand, the anatomy of the hand, because of the texting thumbs. So there are some light-hearted things we can apply to this. But also, of course, I had to look at all the different arguments, if you like, for banning smartphones. One was actually that phones can create inequality. Depending on your catchment area, you might find, as I did, I worked in a lovely, diverse school, but there was a fair amount of poverty in that particular area. And there were some students who didn't have anything fancy. They probably didn't even have smartphones. They maybe just had a very old-fashioned mobile phone. Now, whilst that would have been better perhaps for their mental health, certainly according to what we've discussed, it did create inequality because there was this comparison between their phones and the ones of their peers, who had maybe the latest iPhone or Android or whatever. Of course, I mentioned the real risks that everyone cites, the cyberbullying, the online grooming and radicalization, the upskirting. They are real risks, and they are definitely arguments against the use of phones within school. But then, of course, we can't control what happens outside of school. And a lot of cyberbullying will be carrying on, not just in school hours, but outside of school. Another, I suppose, irritant, if you like, and distraction when kids are using smartphones in the classroom is that, I don't know about you, but most of the schools I've worked in, the Wi-Fi is fairly patchy. So certainly in my last classroom, if I wanted to do an online quiz or Kahoot or something, it would result in everyone scrambling to the back of the classroom and holding their phones up to the windows, because that was really the only place that they could get good reception. So it didn't do much for perhaps the concentration of the class. Mind you, when you're doing a Kahoot, it doesn't matter too much, does it? So I think we could say that, yeah, there's certainly an issue with classroom distraction, but there is also an issue with the contributing factor that it has towards emotional instability. And if we zoom out and look at it, we could say that trusting young people with these amazing tools was an experiment. And sometimes it can be very good. They can use their phones for research. to become more independent in their studies. Perhaps they're working as a group and researching something and creating a presentation or whatever. So I'm certainly not by any means saying that smartphones are entirely bad. They're not. And perhaps we should be looking at how can we teach young people to use their phones responsibly. But it's such a massive area, isn't it? And I think a lot of teachers just simply don't feel prepared to deal with, all the implications. So banning is one solution, perhaps, or one piece of the solution. But I think that we're also looking at whether we need to influence a change in culture, whether we need to rebuild relationships amongst the students themselves, but also between students and adults. So there isn't this huge divide kind of exacerbated by the smartphone. So perhaps those changes in relationships are the real solution. And it can happen just a little bit at a time, can't it? I know, thinking about being a parent, when my sons were still living at home, you could see how tempting it would be to become more and more withdrawn from sort of family life and what was happening outside. And I remember one of my rules was that we would always eat together and that no smartphones were allowed at the table. But my partner at that stage was completely addicted to his phone, and he was he was definitely one of the worst offenders. So, I also recognize that there is the example that we set and a certain amount of modeling that we do or could do to influence children positively. And I think for all of us, some kind of digital detox is very healthy and do family relationships and just energy generally the world of good. So policies matter. I think we can agree that. And at the same time, we could perhaps agree that culture matters more. And it's culture, it's that connection, the feeling of safety, trust that exists. That's what we need to rebuild little by little. I think it's possible, but I think, as usual, that teachers are crucial. They're part of the front line in this campaign or this movement for positive change, and perhaps fighting against that kind of insidious effect that influencers such as Andrew Tate, etc., have on the young people that we work with. So if we can't pinpoint when it all changed, maybe that's because it wasn't just one moment. It was a series of tiny compromises and tiny losses of connection. But maybe we can start taking it back the same way. Small changes, the modeling that we do, the encouragement that we as teachers always give to our pupils, and as parents, can affect in our own families. So thank you for listening to Kind Words for Tired Teachers today. And if this conversation resonated with you, please share it with a friend or a colleague or anyone you think might need a little bit of encouragement. And until next time, please take care of yourself and keep doing the work that matters, and know that you are seen and you are appreciated. Thank you very much.